Now, let's start with a truth that's often overlooked in today's conversations about gender. Not all masculinity is toxic. Indeed, most of it is not. And yet, increasingly, we're seeing a narrative emerge in public discourse that seems to conflate the worst expressions of masculinity with the entire category. When we do that, when we fail to distinguish between harmful behaviors and healthy male traits, we're not just being unfair, we're also being unhealthy. There's a profound difference between masculinity that expresses itself through dominance, aggression, and entitlement, and masculinity that manifests in responsibility, courage, resilience, and care. The trouble is, the former has been so loud and visible that it's become shorthand for the latter. But equating masculinity with toxicity is like equating leadership with tyranny or ambition with greed. It's a distortion, and it's one that's having very real consequences, particularly for boys and young men who are in the process of trying to figure out who they are and who they want to become. Think about the experience of a teenage boy growing up today. He's likely aware that discussions about gender are everywhere, on social media, in school, in the news. He hears a lot about how men have caused harm, about patriarchy, about privilege, and much of that critique is valid. Men have historically held disproportionate power. They still do in many places. But if that boy doesn't hear at the same time an affirmative vision of what it means to be a good man, if he isn't told that masculinity can be honorable and generous and essential to society, then he may start to internalize a much darker message that to be male is to be inherently suspect. That's not an empowering message, it's a defeating one. And it's showing up in the data. If you see boys falling behind in school, withdrawing socially, struggling with mental health, and turning to ideologies, sometimes very dangerous ones, that promise to give them a sense of worth, identity, and community. These aren't just statistics, they're warning signs. They tell us that something isn't working in the way we're engaging boys, especially when it comes to conversations about masculinity. Now, to be clear, this isn't an argument against criticizing harmful male behavior. We should call out misogyny. We should dismantle systems that perpetuate inequality. But we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because masculinity, like femininity, is a cultural construct layered over biological foundations. It evolves, it adapts, and it can be shaped toward good ends or bad. The task before us is not to abandon masculinity or shame it out of existence, but to reimagine it responsibly, thoughtfully, constructively. What does that mean in practice? It means recognizing that many traits traditionally associated with masculinity, physical strength, stoicism, competitiveness, even a certain instinct for protection, aren't inherently negative. In fact, they can be powerful forces for good when harnessed with character and conscience. A firefighter running into a burning building, a father working 3 jobs to provide for his family, a teenage boy standing up for a friend being bullied. These aren't outdated stereotypes. They're real examples of how masculine energy, rightly directed, can serve others and strengthen communities. But too often these kinds of examples are overlooked or dismissed as exceptions, or worse, they're seen as relics of a time we've supposedly outgrown. The result is a vacuum, a moral and cultural vacuum where positive models of masculinity should be. And like all vacuums, it gets filled. Sometimes by influencers who offer a seductive but ultimately regressive vision of what it means to be a man. Sometimes by apathy, withdrawal, or resentment. Either way, the outcome is the same. Boys and young men are left without a clear, credible path forward. This is why language matters. When we casually label masculinity as toxic, we may feel like we're making a bold critique, but what we're really doing is closing the door on a conversation that desperately needs to stay open. Instead of condemning masculinity wholesale, we need to be asking better questions. What kind of men do we want to raise? What traits do we value in them? How can we foster those traits from a young age? And how can we offer boys a positive, aspirational model of adulthood that doesn't rely on domination, but also doesn't require the erasure of their identity? This is not a theoretical exercise. It has practical implications for how we teach, how we parent, how we mentor, and how we shape our institutions. Schools, for example, need to be spaces where boys feel not just safe, but seen, where they're encouraged to be emotionally intelligent without being made to feel ashamed of being boys. Workplaces need to cultivate male leadership that's collaborative and respectful without demanding that men abandon every part of themselves to fit in. And families need to be places where boys see men fathers, uncles, mentors who embody strength and sensitivity, who lead with integrity rather than ego. We can do all this. We can affirm a vision of masculinity that is strong, moral, and socially constructive, but we can't do it if our starting point is suspicion. We can't do it if we tell every boy that he's part of the problem simply because of who he is. And we certainly can't do it if we continue to treat masculinity as something to be corrected rather than cultivated. So the choice before us is clear. We can continue to wage a relentless rhetorical war on masculinity, hoping that by tearing it down, we'll build something better in its place. Or we can take the harder, more necessary path, to engage boys and men where they are, to call them into responsibility without shaming their identity, and to build a culture that values the contributions of good men. Because good men are not the problem. In many cases, they're the solution. The roles of men are changing, and that's not a crisis, it's a challenge. But it's one we must face with intention. There is an ongoing cultural narrative suggesting that masculinity itself is the problem, that somehow, if we could just deconstruct or even dismantle the concept of masculinity, society would find its balance. But this view ignores a vital truth. Masculinity, like any social identity, is not fixed. It evolves, and it must evolve. The challenge we face isn't that masculinity is under attack in some vague ideological war. It's that the traditional guideposts for being a man have shifted and in many cases disappeared entirely. That can leave young men especially without a clear sense of direction. For much of history, being a man was tied to a fairly predictable life script. A boy would grow into a man by stepping into clear economic and social roles: provider, protector, head of household. These were not optional roles. They were expected. And for better or worse, they offered a framework of identity and purpose. But in today's world, these roles are no longer assigned automatically. They must be earned, negotiated, or in some cases, completely redefined. The problem is that while we have become very good at telling young men what not to be, don't be domineering, don't be repressive, don't be entitled, we haven't done enough to offer an affirmative vision of what they should be. That vacuum matters. When young men are no longer needed in the same way they once were, we must ensure they are still valued. When the pathway to adulthood is no longer paved with economic necessity and rigid gender roles, we must still provide a sense of purpose and a reason to grow. Without that, we shouldn't be surprised when many young men withdraw from school, from work, from relationships. And they are. The data is clear. Boys are falling behind in education, men are disappearing from the labor force, and rates of loneliness and suicide among young men are rising. This is not simply a matter of individual failure. It is in part a cultural and structural failure to prepare them for a world that has changed faster than we've helped them adapt. It's easy to romanticize the past, but I am not advocating for a return to rigid gender norms. On the contrary, progress demands change. The liberation of women from traditional roles has been one of the greatest triumphs of modern society. But progress must be inclusive. We cannot celebrate the transformation of women's roles while neglecting the redefinition of men's roles. If one gender's identity is allowed to evolve, so must the others. Otherwise, we leave half the population disoriented, defensive, or disengaged. Too often, when we talk about the future of men and boys, the conversation slips into a defensive crouch, as if acknowledging their struggles means rolling back progress for women. That is not the case. It is possible, and indeed essential, to hold two truths simultaneously. Women still face barriers and inequalities that demand action, and men too are navigating an identity crisis that deserves attention. One does not cancel out the other. Equity is not a finite resource. What we need is a new, forward-looking model of masculinity, one that is strong but not rigid, responsible but not repressive. We need to elevate qualities that have always been part of the male tradition: courage, leadership, sacrifice, but reinterpret them in ways that fit today's world. Being a good man in the 21st century might mean being an engaged father, a supportive partner, a lifelong learner, or a community builder. These are not lesser versions of manhood. They are updated expressions of it. There is also a practical dimension to this. Take education, for example. The modern school system has increasingly favored traits like compliance, organization, and verbal fluency. areas where on average girls tend to excel earlier than boys. Yet we haven't adjusted our teaching strategies or school structures to better support boys in their learning journey. Instead, we allow the gender gap in education to grow, and then we pathologize the boys who fall behind. We should be asking different questions, not what's wrong with boys, but how can we meet them where they are and help them grow? Similarly, in the workplace, the shift from a manufacturing economy to a knowledge economy has disproportionately affected working class men. Jobs that once offered not just a paycheck, but a sense of identity and pride have vanished, and the replacement hasn't come fast enough. The solution isn't to lament the loss of the old world, but to equip men with the skills and confidence they need to succeed in the new one. That means investing in vocational training, apprenticeships, and new models of education that offer more than one pathway to success. And in relationships, we must encourage emotional literacy without shaming traditional male traits. We want men to be more expressive, more attuned, more emotionally available, but we also need to recognize that many have not been taught how to do that. Vulnerability for many men doesn't come naturally. It comes as a risk. If we want to help them open up, we must create spaces that feel safe and constructive, not critical or accusatory. All of this points to a larger cultural responsibility. We need a narrative about masculinity that is not built on guilt or grievance, but on growth. We need to affirm that there is still such a thing as being a good man, not in contrast to being a good woman, but alongside it. Not in defense of outdated power structures, but in service of a more equitable and connected society. Masculinity is not static. It never has been. What it means to be a man today is different than it was 50 years ago, and it will be different again 50 years from now. But if we want that future to be one in which boys grow into healthy, capable, and fulfilled men, we need to stop telling them they are obsolete and start helping them write a new story, one that honors the past without being trapped by it, and that embraces the future with purpose and possibility. The roles of men are changing, yes, but that's not a crisis. It's a call to action. When masculinity is framed solely as a problem, boys absorb the message that they are defective by nature. Now, let me pause on that because it matters deeply. This isn't some throwaway line in a cultural debate. This is something I've seen again and again reflected in classrooms, in counseling sessions, in survey data, and perhaps most heartbreakingly in the eyes of many young men themselves. If a boy hears explicitly or implicitly that who he is, his instincts, his way of relating to the world, his aspirations, is somehow inherently harmful, the result isn't. The result is shame, confusion, and in many cases, withdrawal. This matters because we are living through a moment where many boys and young men are already in retreat. They're falling behind in school. They're more likely to drop out, to be diagnosed with learning disorders, to be disengaged from academic life altogether. In the US, it's for every 100 women who earn a bachelor's degree, only about 74 men do. Among those earning master's degrees, the gap is even wider. And this is not about capacity or potential. It's about engagement. The data is telling us something very clearly. Boys as a group are struggling to find purpose and belonging in our educational systems. And it doesn't stop with school. Young men are also struggling in the workforce. Labor force participation among men without college degrees has plummeted. They're spending less time working, more time isolated, and often more time online in unproductive and sometimes destructive ways. And mental health? Well, it's quietly becoming a silent crisis. Young men are much more likely to die by suicide than young women, and yet they're far less likely to seek help. Loneliness, depression, and despair are not the monopoly of any one gender, but they are manifesting in unique and troubling ways among our young men. Now, I want to be clear about something here. This is not an excuse for bad behavior. It is not a plea for coddling. It is a call to understand, to listen, to offer guidance instead of guilt. Because what I fear is that in our rightful and long overdue reckoning with the harms of patriarchy and the structures that have historically privileged men, we've leaned too far into a narrative that treats masculinity itself as the root problem, that every expression of masculinity is suspect, that ambition is aggression, that stoicism is repression, that leadership is dominance. But if we tell boys that their instincts must be unlearned, not shaped, that their strengths are liabilities, not assets, then we shouldn't be surprised when they check out, or worse, when they lash out. The truth is, masculinity, like femininity, is a broad and diverse spectrum. It's not a monolith, it's not fixed, but neither is it meaningless. And the great task before us is not to erase masculine norms, but to refine them. Not to tear down the idea of being a man, but to help build a better, healthier, more grounded model of manhood that starts with affirming to boys that they are not broken, that they are not a threat, that being male is not something they need to apologize for. We must offer boys a positive script for who they can become, a vision of masculinity that is strong but not domineering, that is emotionally literate but not fragile, that is competitive without being cruel, that embraces the role of protector not as an assertion of power, but as a form of service, that sees responsibility not as a burden, but as a gift. Because when we don't give boys that script, they will find one elsewhere. And in today's digital world, the alternatives are just a few clicks away. Influencers and online subcultures are more than happy to offer a seductive, but ultimately hollow vision of manhood. One rooted in grievance, in domination, in zero-sum thinking. One that teaches boys that strength lies in defiance, not discipline. That power is about control, not character. If we continue to paint masculinity in such broad negative strokes, we risk creating a vacuum, and that vacuum will not remain empty. It will be filled by those who know exactly how to prey on insecurity, alienation, and fear. We must instead build bridges between who boys are and who they could be, between the qualities we celebrate in men, courage, resilience, leadership, and the way we nurture those qualities from a young age. That means rethinking how we educate boys, how we talk to them, how we model manhood for them. It means creating spaces where they can talk about their struggles without feeling weak. It means letting them know that asking for help is not a sign of failure, but of strength. It also means showing them that masculinity and morality are not in conflict, that to be a good man is not to deny who they are, but to channel it toward good ends. We often tell girls, you can be anything. That message has power, but do we say the same to boys? Or do we only tell them what not to be? It's time to shift the narrative, to speak to our boys not with suspicion, but with hope, not with blame, but with belief. They need to hear that masculinity is not something they must shed in order to be good. It is something they can shape to do good, so that they can be gentle without being weak, that they can be strong without being cruel, that they can lead without dominating, love without losing themselves, and feel deeply without shame. We owe them that message, because if we don't give them a path forward, we leave them wandering, and too many of them already are. The question isn't whether masculinity should change, it already is. The question is whether we will participate in that change thoughtfully or let others define it for us in ways that are damaging to both men and women. So let's stop telling boys what they shouldn't be. Let's start showing them what they can become. Helping men and boys thrive is not a zero-sum game. We do not need to choose between supporting the advancement of women and recognizing the challenges that men face. In fact, we can and must do both. The mistake we are making far too often is treating gender as a battlefield where one side's gain must inevitably mean the other's loss. That's not only intellectually lazy, but deeply harmful to the very fabric of our social progress. Now, of course, it's undeniable that progress for women has been both historic and hard-won, and rightly so. The past several decades have seen women break down barriers in education, employment, politics, and culture. That is something to be celebrated, protected, and continued. But what we fail to realize, or what we are still struggling to come to terms with, is that this transformation has taken place in a society where we have not done nearly enough to help men adapt to a world that's changed around them. The male role was once clear: be the provider, the protector, the stoic. For better or worse, those roles offered structure and identity, but as the economy has shifted away from manual labor and toward knowledge work, as women have entered and excelled in higher education, as traditional family structures have evolved, many of those old male roles have become less relevant or have vanished altogether. And the trouble is, we haven't offered boys and men an alternative script. We've simply erased the old one and expected them to figure out the rest on their own. What's worse, we've created a culture where even expressing concern for the well-being of men and boys is treated with suspicion, as if caring about boys' falling educational outcomes, rising suicide rates, and increasing social isolation is somehow an affront to feminism. It is not. It is a necessary part of a complete and mature gender conversation, because a society that ignores the suffering of half its population is not a just society. It's a broken one. And yet, when we try to raise these issues, we're often met with pushback. We're told that focusing on men's issues is a distraction or even a form of regression. But that assumes that gender equity has a finish line and that women alone haven't yet reached it. The reality is gender equity is not a race with a single winner. It's a balancing act, constantly shifting as our society evolves. The fact that girls are now outperforming boys in almost every level of education, for example, doesn't mean girls are too successful. It means boys are struggling, and that should concern all of us. If we are serious about equity, we have to be serious about male disadvantage too. Consider this. In the United States today, the typical girl is more likely than the typical boy to graduate high school, go to college, and earn a degree. She is also more likely to avoid addiction, more likely to stay out of jail, and more likely to maintain strong social ties. That's not a critique of her success. It's a call to pay attention to the boys who are falling through the cracks. And let's be clear, we're not just talking about elite circles or isolated pockets. These trends are widespread and well documented. In some communities, especially working class and rural areas, the decline in male labor force participation, the retreat from marriage, and the rise in loneliness are reaching crisis levels. And yet, these issues remain under-discussed in mainstream gender discourse. We continue to focus exclusively on empowering women and girls, while too often dismissing the pain and confusion of men as either self-inflicted or irrelevant. That mindset is not only unhelpful, it's dangerous. Because when men feel ignored or shamed, they don't simply disappear, they retreat, they disengage. And when that disengagement turns into resentment, it becomes fertile ground for extremism, nihilism, and division. In short, when we neglect boys and men, we don't just fail them, we fail society. The health of any community depends on the full participation of everyone in it. And right now, we are leaving too many men behind. This doesn't mean we should stop talking about women's rights or ignore the very real ways in which women continue to face structural inequality. But it does mean we must grow out of the simplistic narrative that all power is male and all victimhood is female. That was never entirely true, and it is becoming less true by the day. If we want to build a more equal future, we need to stop thinking in binary terms. We need to recognize that men can be both privileged and vulnerable, that women can be both empowered and constrained, that gender is not a moral hierarchy, but a complex human reality. And what would it look like if we took this approach seriously? It would mean acknowledging that boys need more male teachers, especially in the early years. It would mean investing in fatherhood initiatives, not just for legal or financial reasons, but for emotional and social ones. It would mean reforming our education system to better engage boys who are more likely to struggle with reading, ADHD, and school discipline. It would mean designing mental health campaigns that speak directly to men in ways that resonate with their sense of identity and dignity. In short, it would mean caring enough about men and boys to meet them where they are, not where we wish they were. And importantly, it would mean doing all of this not in opposition to feminism, but alongside it, not by rolling back the gains women have made, but by recognizing that gender equity requires walking and chewing gum at the same time. It's not enough to tear down old stereotypes of what women can't do. We also need to build up new models of what men can be. Models that are strong, yes, but also nurturing, competitive perhaps, but also collaborative, ambitious, but not at the expense of connection and care. This is not just a matter of fairness, it's a matter of survival. Because if we continue to ignore the male malaise, if we allow the conversation around masculinity to be dominated either by ideological scorn or reactionary backlash, then we are handing the future over to the loudest, angriest voices. We are telling the next generation of boys that their struggles don't matter, that their feelings are invalid, and that their identity is inherently suspect. That is a recipe for dysfunction, not progress. The truth is, Masculinity is not the enemy. The enemy is a culture that refuses to engage with nuance. The enemy is silence and shame and neglect